Hello, it's The Week in Art. I'm Ben Luke. This week, Georgia O'Keeffe's paintings of 1920s New York, London non-profit Studio Voltaire's 30th anniversary, and Martha Jungwirth responds to Goya. As the Art Institute of Chicago opens an exhibition dedicated to what Georgia O'Keeffe called her New York's paintings of skyscrapers and views from one of them across the East River that marked a turning point in her career, Sarah Kelly Oehler, one of the curators of the exhibition, tells us more. One of the most distinctive of all London's contemporary art spaces, Studio Voltaire, is celebrating its 30th anniversary this year and has begun a fundraising drive to consolidate its future, with a gala dinner this week and a Christie's auction later this month. I talked to the chair of Studio Voltaire's trustees and a non-executive director of Frieze, Victoria Siddall, about the anniversary and the precarious funding landscape, even for the UK's most dynamic non-profits. And this episode's Work of the Week is an untitled painting from the Austrian painter Martha Jungwirth's 2022 series Francisco de Goya, Still Life with Ribs and Lamb's Head. Based on the work by the Spanish master in the Louvre in Paris, Jungwirth's painting features in a new survey of her work that's just opened at the Guggenheim Bilbao in Spain. And I speak to its curator, Lekha Hileman Waitoller. Before all that, our latest subscription offer, a free 8-week trial of a digital subscription to the Art Newspaper. Visit theartnewspaper.com to find out more. And do also subscribe to this podcast and to our sister podcast, A Brush With, wherever you're listening. The latest episode of A Brush With is with Lynn Hirschman-Leeson. Please also give us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. Now, a new exhibition at the Art Institute of Chicago looks at the remarkable paintings Georgia O'Keeffe made in New York in the second half of the 1920s, made in response to views she absorbed on her walks around the city and from views from her suite on the 30th floor of the then brand new skyscraper that housed the Shelton Hotel. They mark a pivotal moment in O'Keeffe's career. The co-curator of the exhibition is Sarah Kelly Oehler, and I spoke to her about the show. Sarah, Georgia O'Keeffe started making paintings of New York's skyline, its buildings, around 1925. What prompted her to do this?
So O'Keeffe started painting New York skylines and skyscraper views around 1925 because she moved into the Shelton Hotel, as we discovered, for the first time in November of 1924. It had been previously thought that she moved into the Shelton in the fall of 1925 after she started painting. But in fact, our research proved that she moved in November of 1924 just for a month, and that was clearly a tremendous catalyst for her. It clearly radically transformed her interest in the city as a subject matter, and she began painting it after that.
Do you think she conceived of this idea of being both up high and right at the bottom at the same time? Because that's the remarkable thing about her New Yorks is you've got these amazing vertiginous views from the street, and then you've got these amazing views from right at the top of the Shelton Hotel. So do you think she conceived of that together, or did that emerge more organically?
I think it's a little bit of both, actually. So initially, most of the views that she's making are views from street level looking up at buildings. We know that she painted a number of views of the Shelton Hotel, several of which she destroyed because she was not happy with them for whatever reason. And we know that she painted New York Street with Moon, which is an early streetscape that she cited as her first New York painting. But there is one drawing that I began to think is actually quite possibly an early drawing, possibly as early as late 1924. And so we dated it 1924 to about 1926 because she cited this drawing, and it's in the collection of the Fine Arts Museum in San Francisco. She cited this drawing as being the view out of the window that she lived in for a short time. And it's a view looking from the Shelton, mid-building, directly west at St. Patrick's Cathedral and all the buildings in between. And that means that she had to have had a unit that was on the west side of the building, of the Shelton Hotel. And that logically could only, in fact, be that 1 month stay where we've not been able to identify what unit she stayed in.
Got you. I love this. Great curatorial detective work. The curious thing is that you mentioned the painting with the moon earlier on, this first New York picture. She wanted to display it earlier than she did, but Alfred Stieglitz, her husband, who was the photographer and great art dealer at the same time, he resisted that, didn't he? Tell us why you think that is, because I think this is a really important story in this wider story.
Right. I agree. So this is all a story that O'Keeffe told retrospectively. So I think it bears looking at with that in mind, that she was recounting this in many cases decades later. But as she told the story, she had finished this painting, and I think that's accurate, in time for an exhibition called Seven Americans. And that was an important show that Stieglitz was putting on at his gallery that was really intended to be a showcase of the latest and most important work of the group of artists included. And that was O'Keeffe and Stieglitz, but also John Marin and other members of the Stieglitz circle. So it was intended to introduce the breadth of their work at this time. And O'Keeffe indeed exhibited about 30 paintings in this show. So it was a large showing for her. And as she said it, she said, the men wouldn't let me display New York Street with Moon, that there was a perfect place for it, but that she was told, and this is a quote, leave New York to the men. And with that, she then could not display it that year and was infuriated by this fact. This was something that clearly upset her greatly, that she was being pigeonholed into what was seen as acceptable subject matter.
Right. And this was all part of a kind of program for her that Stieglitz was trying to impose, right, which was about femininity. And it was sort of dictated partly by his own photographs of her, these very famous photographs that he took of her, but also about her art as well. So he was trying to sort of massage her career in a particular direction, right?
Right. There's been a lot of scholarship on Stieglitz and his attitude towards women artists and femininity. And certainly he seemed to be searching for, as he phrased it, the great woman artist. And he certainly found that in O'Keeffe, although O'Keeffe herself rejected the idea that she was a great woman artist. She didn't want that qualifier. And ultimately, his goal was obviously to promote her career, but to promote a view of it. And he certainly, with the portrait of Georgia O'Keeffe, the over 300 photographs that he took of O'Keeffe in preceding years, had solidified an image of O'Keeffe in the press that was one that would stick with her in perhaps a negative way for many years, which was of a woman who was unbounded in her sexuality, whose paintings were clearly connected to her sexuality. So I do think it's something we've deduced, but I think there is an element of wanting her New York paintings, these skyscraper subjects, to counteract that narrative, to give a new sense of what her work could be. With one critic later on, she actually thanked him for turning off the emotional faucet, which was
I love that
her
line.
way of referring to it, as a sort of desexualized narrative that he was putting forth and really looking at her paintings for what they were.
Absolutely. Now, tell us more about those paintings, because she had a real knack for finding the right format, it seems to me. And they're unusual formats in both dimensions, in the sense that they're narrow when they're in portrait format, and then they're very wide, like a kind of widescreen when they're in landscape format. And this was super effective in terms of the description of the city that she wanted, wasn't it?
It was very effective in how she's thinking about the city. She was using more of a panoramic format for her East River views and these long, skinny, vertical compositions for New York paintings. But I will say it's evident that she's making similar decisions about other subject matter. So this is not something that is limited to her New York paintings, these decisions on format. She liked these canvases that had somewhat unusual proportions. And so you see them in a work such as The Eggplant, which is very tall and skinny, or a picture of corn that she painted in 1924 of corn leaves is also equally tall and skinny. So she is taking very similar format canvases. The first decision she made at any point was, what's the size of the canvas? What's the orientation of the canvas? And that is helping shape her vision of the work to come.
Now, she said, one can't paint New York as it is, but rather as it is felt. What do you think she meant by that?
I think this is a moment where New Yorkers are used to a certain element of celebration of progress, of American progress, of industrial progress. And that often revolved around a sort of telling of the truth of American industry. And I think that in many ways, she wasn't interested in the truth of the city. She's interested in her own sensation of the city. and of capturing something that was deeply personal to her. And I think her ideal was that it would evoke a response in you as the person looking at the painting, but I'm not sure that she needed it to be the same response. I think she wanted it to evoke a response and to be powerful in some way and have it connect into a sense of emotion. But she is putting it down because of her own emotions and her own sensations.
Right, and her own sensations are so profound, aren't they? I'm thinking the painting called East River from the Shelton, East River #1. There's this incredibly visionary effect from this sun at the top of the painting and these incredible colours and so on. So, yes, she's getting a lot of the kind of detail of the kind of landscape and the cityscape right, but she's also really, really painting her feelings, isn't she?
Right, absolutely. I mean, that's a painting that when I first saw it, my immediate thought was it's almost like she's thinking about symbolism, you know, with the sort of vividness of the orb of the sunspots that reappear, which are also in our own Shelton with sunspots, and then this hard take on color that is so non-naturalistic in some ways, and certainly connects back to her interest in abstraction at this moment, but are so fascinating and different from anything else she did. It is certainly the sense that she caught this moment and solidified it into a composition.
And she wanted to, it seems to me, explore the very, very contemporaneity of the developments in New York of that time, in that she would seek out the buildings that were making the biggest impact on the city. So the Radiator building is that extraordinary and totally idiosyncratic building, and she wanted to depict it and gather its sort of special effects, if you like.
So she was very offhand about that building later on. She sort of framed it as, I would walk by it, so of course I had to paint it. But yes, that was the spectacle of the era. I don't think, though, that she was seeking out every spectacle of the era, but she certainly had an eye for new developments that were in her daily walks, that were part of her daily experience around Midtown Manhattan. If you look at the buildings she's painted, they're all within a fairly narrow band of the city. For example, Ritz Tower she paints, and that was notable. It was a very tall building on an otherwise unremarkable short block of Park Avenue, but it was also 2 blocks from Stieglitz's gallery. So she's walking by every single day, you know, the building Ritz Tower, and then paints it. And so likewise, she says with Radiator building, I walked by it all the time, and so I had to paint it. But certainly she is attuned to this new architecture and the dynamic potential that it presented. And something like Radiator building with this illuminated crown, the black cladding was so unusual at that moment. And then, of course, the architect set up an illumination program that was designed to draw an attention. And contemporaneous newspaper articles talk about crowds gathering to watch the illumination of the Radiator building. And so it would make sense that O'Keeffe would be drawn to something like that spectacle.
Yeah, there's a lovely note in your essay where you kind of fantasize that she may have been in that throng looking up. You don't know that, but the detail with which she observes this building seems to suggest that she's spent a long time looking at it, at least.
Yeah, definitely.
So it's a curious idea that she may well have been excited, but she played it down later.
Right. I mean, you know, it's again, a very different thing to be looking back retrospectively at a career and a moment in one's career 50 years earlier, thinking about how to create that legacy.
Now, the views of the East River, of course, across the water, they feature wonderful sort of flat roofs and then water towers and so on. Then there's the river and the cityscape across the river. Is there any social commentary amongst all this? Because, of course, the towers are belching smoke and so on. You've got environmental pollution very visibly depicted. Was it a social commentary?
I think that raises an interesting question. Often O'Keeffe, her works are seen as somewhat divorced from any sort of social context. Certainly, when she finally went to the Southwest in 1929, that was so appealing to her because of this big, open, empty space, as she saw it, that had crisp, clean skies. So whether she's trying to comment in the East River paintings or not, it was certainly something that she noticed and lived with. But again, she was high above this. So she is using those elements artistically. I mean, I think there's such a fascinating difference between works such as the very large East River painting that has this crisp, clean sense of air, and something like, I'm going to say Wichita's painting because I can't remember the exact title, so we can get that for you. But the East River that is so atmospheric, almost like she's looking at Whistler. So she's trying out different approaches. Certainly, I think aesthetics are always first and foremost her interests. And so I'm not willing to absolutely say that she's thinking about smoke and pollution in a meaningful social context sort of way.
But there's this interesting thing that as well as walking on the streets to depict certain other buildings, she's walking around the Shelton building as well. Because as you say, obviously the apartment amazingly is on that top floor, so they have extraordinary views. But she's also going on to sort of lobbies lower down the building to get different perspectives.
Yes, although not as much. I mean, she's really mostly depicting from her unit, and I think that's what's fascinating to me. This is an aspect of her work in which the view is fixed. And we see this later on the Southwest, where she's painting the patio door over and over again. The view is a fixed view, and so it feeds all sorts of artistic experimentation. So yes, there are definitely sketches that she does from other parts of the Shelton, sort of quick notes to herself. A great painting called New York Night, in which she's clearly up high in the Shelton, looking straight out at the Beverly Hotel. But for the most part, if she's on the Shelton, she's interested in the East River view.
Now, the funny thing about Stieglitz saying that he didn't want to display this earlier New York view is that when she does start showing them, she gets instant success. Tell us about that.
Yes, this is also part of her story. So again, with a grain of salt, but she recounts that she is unable to display it in 1925. In 1926, she has a solo exhibition at Stieglitz's gallery, which was going to become a regular occurrence every year. And she included several New York paintings. And she sold New York Street with Moon the very same day. And she later said in this sort of wonderful way, no one ever questioned my painting New York after that, because this was the moment where she earns a lot of money very quickly. And we see that over and over again. A number of these New York paintings sold out of the exhibitions that they were held in at Stieglitz's gallery for significant sums of money. And so she actually cited 1927 as the year that she could live with financial independence off of her earnings as an artist.
Yeah, it's fascinating that, isn't it? Because it's actually a really short period in her life, actually. She's so prolific. She produces such an array of fantastic paintings. But we're talking about a period of 5 years or so. And though she does depict New York later, it's not with that same intensity, and it's in a very different manner. Is that right?
Right. And I don't want to imply that her other works are not starting to sell. So her flower paintings are also starting to sell for good sums of money. But again, I think it points to her grabbing control of her career at this moment and very deliberately engaging in a model of artistic production that becomes very noteworthy and very successful.
Why does she stop painting New York with the same intensity? Is it just a matter of the fact that she goes to the Southwest and that becomes her obsession? Or does she feel like she's exhausted New York somehow? So
O'Keeffe, interestingly, talked about with every subject that she would paint it in series until she felt she had exhausted the subject. And so, in fact, that she stopped painting New York is not surprising. She absolutely had started going to the Southwest on an annual basis, and that captured her interest with a fervency, just as New York had 5 years before. But she only wanted to paint until she felt like she had nothing more to say. And so while we do see a few later works where she felt that she needed to sort of bring the subject back into her life, clearly this sort of moment of intensity led to a sense of satisfaction that she had said what she wanted to say. Now, she did say later on that she always would see subjects in the big city that she wanted to paint and have never gotten to. So I think it was always there as sort of this draw, but that also reflects, a city that is constantly changing. Every time she would go back after 1949, it would be a different city. We see her photographing new buildings like the Seagram building, which didn't exist when she lived there full time. And so ultimately, there is this element of discovery that a place like Manhattan certainly would present her. But I think fundamentally, the Southwest was, so important to her that she never exhausted all of the great variety of the Southwest in her mind.
And lastly, obviously we know the effect that it had on her career, the making of these New York paintings, in the sense that she started selling, as you say, and this really gave her a lift. What do you think it did in terms of her artistic development? Did she do things here that she then carries into the later work?
I personally think she did. I mean, we see her thinking about structure with the New York skyscrapers that she's already thinking about to a certain extent with trees. She's thinking about creating monumental forms pictured boldly against the front of the picture plane. She really hones that in New York City. And then she's looking at the forms of the Southwest with conditioned eyes. So she's really coming to the Southwest already having experienced canyon views, not the canyons of the Southwest, but the canyons of Manhattan, or thinking about these strange tall buildings that dominate the composition in a way that you then see elements dominating compositions in the Southwest. I think that this is more the reality of O'Keeffe as somebody who never herself pigeonholed her work into different sections. So there's so much cross-fertilization across all of her different works that every step of her artistic career, she's just building on everything she's done before. And so the New Yorks are so much a part of that. And it's so important to understand that they are part of this development, that in fact, the artist we see in the Southwest, who might be doing something with a completely different subject, is building on an entire history through the 1920s that, very importantly, included her New Yorks.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you.
Georgia O'Keeffe, My New Yorks, is at the Art Institute of Chicago until the 22nd of September. It then travels to the High Museum of Art in Atlanta from the 25th of October to the 16th of February next year. Coming up, Studio Voltaire's 30th anniversary, and Martha Jungwirth responds to Goya. But first, here's this week's news bulletin. Following last month's cyber attack against Christie's, a client of the auction house filed a class action complaint in the Southern District of New York on Monday over Christie's inability to protect the personally identifiable information of what are estimated to be at least 500,000 current and former bidders registered in its databases. The complaint requests a range of damages as well as the payment of the plaintiff's legal expenses. It also seeks court orders that would require Christie's to undertake a long list of actions related to its client data and information security. The only plaintiff currently named is Evstathios Maroulis, who the complaint defines only as a resident and citizen of Dallas in Texas. Christie's has yet to comment on the lawsuit. As student and academic protests in relation to Israel and Gaza surge in several countries, the photographer, curator and activist Shahid Al-Alam has returned his honorary doctorate from the University of the Arts London in solidarity with its students and their stance on Israel's military action. Alam criticised the position of James Purnell as the Vice-Chancellor of the university. Purnell, a former MP, was the chair of Labour Friends of Israel between 2002 and 2004. The protesting students are demanding his resignation. Meanwhile, two occupations are in progress on the campus of Goldsmiths College, University of London. One at the Goldsmiths Centre for Contemporary Art, relating to divestment from entities linked to Israel, and another focusing on cuts, which could see more than 130 academics lose their jobs. The former director of the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, Eike Schmidt, who's standing for mayor of the Tuscan city, has been accused of mocking southern Italians. Schmidt, who led the Grand Florence Museum for 7 years and stepped down in December, is the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni's favoured candidate in the Florence local election. He and the right-wing coalition that backs him are determined to win power in the city that has been ruled by the left for the past 4 decades. But Schmidt unleashed a wave of criticism after including the phrase "Florence is not Torre del Greco" on an election pamphlet. Critics claim the director had ridiculed inhabitants of the town near Naples that's frequently stereotyped as a crime-ridden bastion of the Camorra mafia. Schmidt commented that he was merely suggesting that orange trees in Florence's piazzas were more suited to the south. You can read all these stories and more on the website or the app. Now, Studio Voltaire, the not-for-profit exhibition space and studio complex in Clapham, South London, is 30 years old this year. It's marking the anniversary with a series of events, including a gala dinner earlier this week and a Christie's auction later this month. They're part of a plan to consolidate the finances of an institution that's long punched above its weight and is now regarded as a singular and vital part of London's contemporary art ecosystem, but receives comparatively little funding from public sources. I spoke to the chair of Studio Voltaire's trustees, Victoria Siddall, who's also a non-executive director of Frieze, about the organisation and plans for its future. Victoria, it's the 30th anniversary of Studio Voltaire. First of all, let's talk about the name. It's called Studio Voltaire, and I was imagining some highfalutin ex-curator calling on their memories of their favourite literary great, but it's not. It's a very prosaic reason why it's called Studio Voltaire, right?
It does sound very highbrow, it's true. But just by good fortune, Studio Voltaire was originally founded on Voltaire Road. It's now on Nelson's Row in Clapham, so it has moved since those early days 30 years ago, but that's where the name came from.
Right. It was an artist-run space initially, and one of those classic artist-run stories, really. Finding a space, curating your own stuff, taking time out from your practice to be in the office and trying to organise things, right? It was a very sort of ad hoc kind of organisation at that point.
Absolutely. And it was really about a community of artists coming together to find studio space and share studio space. And that still remains at the heart of what Studio Voltaire is today and was a real driver for the capital campaign and redevelopment of the building, which created 40% more space for artist studios in the building. So it's one of the things that's always made Studio Voltaire unique is that it is obviously this space for extraordinary exhibitions and civic programming, but it is also a community of artists who come together every day and work together in the building.
Right. And as well as being the 30th anniversary, it seems to me there's a sort of 20th anniversary here as well, because that's when the programme kind of amped up a bit. It became almost a more professional organisation about 20 years ago when Joe Scotland came in as curator. He's now obviously artistic director. And that programming, and when you look at the artists that started being shown in Studio Voltaire from that point, it's like a kind of amazing list of really major artists, emerging artists, undiscovered artists who were suddenly given a space which they probably hadn't had up until that point.
Yes, that's very true. And so we celebrated Joe's 20th anniversary as director last year. Right. He's also just been awarded an MBE for his work, which is an incredible recognition of everything he's done, but also everything Studio Voltaire has achieved in that time in its sort of quiet way that has a huge impact. And yes, so Studio Voltaire, its mission has always been to champion emerging and underrepresented practices, often giving an artist their first solo exhibition in an institution or their first show in London or in the UK. And so when you look back at the names, some of which are now so familiar to us, you realise what a vital role an organisation like Studio Voltaire plays in the art ecosystem, because really, I often think, the curators of Studio Voltaire have one of the hardest jobs, which is going out there and finding what other people aren't seeing yet, right, and giving it that platform. And as you say, that's included artists like Nairi Bagramian, Phila de Barlow, Anne Collier, Nicole Eisenman, who I think made sculpture for the first time during her residency at Studio Voltaire, which is an incredible show in 2012.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember.
Sanya Kantarovsky, Jamie and Giuliano Villani, Kathy Wilkes, incredible list of artists. And if you look at what those artists have gone on to do, and actually in some cases where those artworks have ended up, there's works that were originally commissioned by Studio Voltaire that have gone on to be presented and collected by institutions including Tate, the Whitney, the British Museum, Moderna Museet. So the ripple effects of Studio Voltaire's work are felt far and wide.
Right, very much so. The interesting thing is it's in Clapham. It's not what we would call an art world centre within London. It's and especially the road it's in. It's not even in really central Clapham. It's a kind of really quiet road. Nearby there's social housing and so on. It's really quite a quiet space. You have to seek it out a bit. And I wonder to what extent that is at one level a disadvantage in the sense that it's not at the centre, so you can't easily get people like collectors and major funders and so on out there, but also an advantage to the artist because it's a quiet space where you can take risks. And I know that risk taking is like a crucial factor in what Joe's always explained to me about Studio Voltaire. It's really trying to work at the cutting edge, and so therefore it's a double-edged sword, its location, right?
Absolutely. And I think, one other thing that is vital to bear in mind is that it's also one of the only art institutions of its kind sort of in that part of London. And it plays a really vital role in the community as well, in terms of public engagement, the kind of civic programming, essentially, the learning, working with school children, also working with teachers, especially given the lack of current art provision in schools. That's actually been a vital aspect of what it does. So having places like Studio Voltaire in parts of London and the UK that are not otherwise served by art institutions is particularly important.
And it's really interesting, if you look at the website for Studio Voltaire, there's this whole section where it looks at that history around that area. And it very much identifies itself within communities of different kinds. So, for instance, there's been a really strong LGBTQIA+ programming strand, and it very clearly locates it within a history of that community in that area and so on. And in all sorts of ways, it's very rooted in Clapham, and also it reaches out to grassroots communities within Clapham. So that the history, community and so on are deeply embedded in everything Studio Voltaire does, it seems to me.
Absolutely. And it's a great kind of balance between the international impact of its programming, but the very, very local impact of its work with communities and this sort of impact on audience. And, you know, something else that Studio Voltaire has done is taken art outside of the gallery as well. They've presented extraordinary artworks in hospitals, on street corners, billboards, bus stops, London Underground stations, an extraordinary commission by Phila de Barlow in a cemetery. They measured the number of people who'd experienced those works. And last year, that was 1.9 million people, which is quite an extraordinary number.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, of course, there's this commercial arm, the House of Voltaire. And it's a really difficult thing to get right, it seems to me, when a public gallery like Studio Voltaire develops a commercial entity. But the thing is that one of the things that I know is that I have items that I've got from House of Voltaire. A lot of them are really affordable for a start, but also there's a deep affection for the House of Voltaire in the art world, which is difficult to get right. You know, becoming more commercial can easily prompt frowns from the art world, can't it?
It can, but I think, look, I mean, Studio Voltaire has always been sort of nimble and ambitious in that way. And, you know, we launched House of Voltaire as a response to a need. You know, we needed to raise money, right. But didn't want to do it in necessarily the traditional way that everyone else had done, and wanted to make it fun as well. And also something that artists responded to with enthusiasm and creativity. And, you know, House of Voltaire was launched as a kind of like a shop brand, essentially, and, you know, and encouraged artists to make a shop product or collaborate with a fashion designer to make something. And it just, I think it really sparked artists' imaginations. And I'm glad to hear that your house is also, like mine, packed with treasures from House of Voltaire over the years.
I covet my Pablo Bronstein matchsticks.
Oh, I have that too. But look, the context of this, I think, is important to state, which is that Studio Voltaire receives 4% of its funding as public funding, essentially, leaving 96% to raise. You know, it's a hugely ambitious target every year that the team needs to address. So initiatives like House of Voltaire are absolutely vital, you know, and I think it also, the success of it points to how artists feel about Studio Voltaire generally, and, you know, what has enabled it to put on these extraordinary shows and program these incredible learning, engagement, civic programs is the support that Studio Voltaire has from artists and from a group of patrons who really understand and appreciate the vision and the mission of what we're doing.
Right. And you've described, or Studio Voltaire has described, the very difficult funding landscape that you're in. I think one of the things that it seems to me must be really crucial in terms of understanding that landscape is the fact that there are 50 plus artists on site, and those artists are in the fortunate position to have a studio there, but at the same time they are having to meet all sorts of really, really difficult criteria for funding of projects and so on. They are very conscious of the kind of precarity of being an artist, and therefore that must transmit itself to the organisation. And it seems to me that's crucial. If you are to understand just how difficult the landscape is, having working artists on site every single day must be incredibly instructive, actually.
Absolutely. It's a really unique insight into the state of affairs for artists, as well as non-profits, obviously, as Studio Voltaire is. And it's not an easy time for non-profits, museums, in all arts organisations across all art forms, I would say. And it's a time that does require initiative and innovation and, frankly, philanthropy as well.
Right.
Like, we're all, you know, reliant on the generosity of individuals as well who really understand what we're doing. And I would also say brands. You know, one of the greatest innovations I think that's launched at Studio Voltaire in recent years is the Louvre Studio Award, which Louvre and Jonathan Anderson saw the need for, but also the impact they could have through this. And of the, as you say, sort of 60 or so studios in the Studio Voltaire building, 7 of those are given to artists with limited financial means. It's means tested. And these are artists who would not otherwise be able to afford to live and work in London. And not only are they giving studios, they're also given a stipend, they're given professional development support and so on. And there've been some incredible success stories through that, actually. One of which is Nena Kalu, who was in the first round of the Louvre studio allocation. and her work's now been acquired by Tate.
Right.
But my understanding is it's Tate's first acquisition of an artist with learning disabilities.
Right.
So an incredible story, again, to sort of start in the grassroots of Studio Voltaire and build out into something really significant.
So within the context of that very difficult funding landscape, the auction, which begins tonight as we're talking, so it's Tuesday as we speak, and the first part of it is part of a gala dinner tonight. So basically there is an amazing roll call of artists that you've convinced to give a work to this auction. But again, you talked about House of Voltaire being necessary. This is necessary if Studio Voltaire needs to do what it wants to do, right?
Absolutely. And this is why we've launched the Studio Voltaire Future Fund, which is essentially what we are getting off the ground tonight with this celebratory 30th anniversary gala. And the response and generosity of artists has been incredibly moving, actually. We're relying on this campaign to allow Studio Voltaire to continue the vital work that it does for the next 5 years. Got quite high ambitions from it, but actually the kind of the generosity that's been shown through Artists Who've Given Works has been extraordinary. And we've got an incredible committee in place. We have people naming studios within the building, many galleries as well, commercial galleries who see the importance of Studio Voltaire in the ecosystem, also donating money, which is wonderful. But as you say, there is an auction taking place of donated artworks. There's also a selling exhibition of donated artworks. Not everything will be auctioned, but a large group of the works will be sold at Christie's in their contemporary sale on the 27th of June. But all of the works in the selling exhibition and the works that will be auctioned are on display at Studio Voltaire.
Right.
So it's possible to go and see them all in person.
Right. And the group of artists that are involved, in a way, it's a kind of reflection of that history. So Nairi Bagramian has given one work, but then you've got an artist like Jake Gruel, a really great young painter who's contributed a work. So there's a sense in which it's both looking backwards across the 30 years of Studio Voltaire's existence, but also looking to the future, as you say, and this future fund is a crucial part of that.
Absolutely. And then artists like Cecily Brown, who hasn't necessarily had a close relationship with the gallery, but sees the importance of the work that Studio Voltaire is doing. Andrew Cranston has given a work, Paulina Lovska, Kathy Wilkes. It's a really incredible group of works, actually. And I think we'll do extremely well. But just in terms of the advocacy of that and the artists showing their support for what Studio Voltaire is doing, it's incredibly important to us as well. It means a lot.
And lastly, what is the ambition then? If you have a future fund, do you want to grow, or is it about keeping going? To what extent is this about consolidation, and to what extent is it about developing new strands, new ideas, and so on?
I'd say it's a combination. Studio Voltaire's always punched above its weight, essentially. And since the reopening of the gallery in 2021, there has been a much bigger ambition and actual, impact in terms of the exhibitions, the engagement with artists, the studio provision, the civic programming, the education programming has all increased dramatically since that reopening, but the public funding has not. And so the Future Fund is essentially meeting that gap and enabling Studio Voltaire to continue this vital work that it's doing, supporting artists, supporting communities for 5 years. That's the goal.
Right. I mean, there's a part of me that's sort of thinking, my God, this shows you just how precarious it all is. Because, I mean, if you look at your anniversary group, it's an amazing group of people. And there are lots for instance, you mentioned Louvre, there's Jonathan Anderson from Louvre is on there. But then you've got loads of commercial gallery people, lots of people with enormous influence. And it makes you think about just how precarious it is for other institutions. Studio Voltaire over 30 years has been lucky enough, or tenacious enough and so on, to build up this incredible reputation. But it really does give you an idea of how difficult the landscape is when you're needing all of these people just to keep this amazing institution going, actually.
Yes. And as I said, look, Studio Voltaire is in a specific position in that, as I said, only 4% of its annual turnover comes from public funding. And most comparable institutions, it's a higher percentage. But I will say, I do think that these concerns apply across the board. This is a really tough time for our organisations generally. And they all need support, from the big museums to small non-profits. And they contribute so much to our society, to our culture, to our soft power as a nation, you know. They really do. And this is something that we should all feel incredibly proud of and responsible for, I think, and do what we can to kind of sustain, especially London, as this real centre of art and creativity and extraordinary organisations like Studio Voltaire.
Victoria, thank you so much.
Pleasure. Great talking to you.
Studio Voltaire have confirmed that a few works were sold at the anniversary dinner, but did not disclose how much was raised. The date of the XXX sale, as it's called, of works to benefit Studio Voltaire at Christie's is yet to be confirmed. Check the organisation's websites for news on that. And Studio Voltaire's current exhibition, Beryl Cook, Tom of Finland, continues until the 25th of August. And finally, it's time for this episode's Work of the Week. A survey of the octogenarian Austrian painter Martha Jungwirth opened this week at the Guggenheim Bilbao. Among 70 works made across several decades of her life in the exhibition are a number of recent responses to the paintings of Francisco de Goya. Among them is an untitled painting riffing on still life with ribs and lamb's head, Goya's picture in the Louvre in Paris. I spoke about the work with Lekha Hileman Waitoller, the curator of the Guggenheim show. Lekha, we're going to be talking about Martha Jungwirth's work, which is in response to Francisco de Goya. But I wanted to begin by just sort of setting the scene on Martha's practice, because she's an artist who's associated with a certain kind of abstraction. But it seems to me that the crucial thing is there's always a non-abstract beginning to each work, that she responds to some kind of imagery as the first principle.
Yes, I agree with that. I think one of the things that makes Martha's work so compelling is that she does sort of navigate this very fine line between figuration or realism and abstraction. So, as you say, there is often sort of the hint of what inspired the image or the composition. Oftentimes for her, this is a memory of something or an impression or a feeling, changing light or a landscape, something like that. You know, you'd be hard pressed to sort of get into a description of what the thing is. But I think that sort of tantalizing line between almost figuring it out, but not quite being able to grasp it is really where the strength of her work lies.
And I love the way she talks about her work. She talks about it like blotches and stains and light. She's very direct in the way that she describes things. She likes to allude to the kind of urgency of their materiality in a way, doesn't she?
Yes, she does. Her way of speaking, I think, is very much reflected in the artwork. There's sort of a bluntness to it, a very visceral quality. I've found myself often using the word raw. Yeah. There's a lot of emotion there, a lot of like splashes of things, blotches, and certainly an aesthetic that is very much anti-perfect. It's also really fun work to look at in depth and sort of look at these different traces of where she's been on the paper because, yeah, it's very visceral.
Was she connected directly to any movement? Because, of course, she comes from a period in Vienna where there was the kind of art informel kind of scene. There's people like Arnulf Reiner, who are probably best known for that kind of very, again, quite visceral abstraction. But was she associated with those artists or very much an individual?
I think of Martha as being very much an individual. And I think there's something very kind of noble about that. But we also might attribute that to the fact that, you know, she's 84 years old this year and not very well known outside of her native Austria or maybe German-speaking countries because she is more known in Germany as well. No, she did come out of art school at a time where the currents weren't so much in line with, I think, her own interests. She was painting more figuratively at the time that she came out of school. The vocabulary that we know her for now developed a little bit later in the mid-70s, and it was recognized and shown at that time, but then there was really quite a long quiet spell for her. So I do tend to think of her as a very individual figure who wasn't interested in following the different trends, also maybe didn't have some of the commercial pressures, which, you know, on the one hand can favor an artist to be working with a really powerful gallery that requires you to be making shows every couple of years and trying to sell work. That wasn't her situation. And so I think in a way it did allow her to continue to just kind of work the way that she wanted to.
Absolutely. That sort of lack of market pressure is difficult for an artist in terms of their survival, but it's actually positive for the work in many, many ways, isn't it?
Right.
Now, let's talk about this latest body of work, because there's this extraordinary, it's been going on for some years, actually. There was a show in London in which we saw some signs of it. But basically, she's been responding to Goya for some years now. She's also been responding to Manet in the latest show, but we're going to talk about her work directly in response to Goya. What does she say about why she's looking at Goya?
So I would preface my answer by saying that one of the things that has always been sort of a source of inspiration or maybe even artistic research for Martha is that she is an artist that is always looking at other artists, particularly more historic artists. She travels a lot. Travel has always also been very, very important to her practice, although the travel that inspires a lot of her work is different from, going to Paris to see important exhibitions. In the case of Goya, he falls in a long line of artists that we could name, that range from the 18th century or potentially even further back to mostly, I would say, 20th century artists that have been influential to her work and her practice. I think like so many artists, looking at the technique, the way that other artists have built their work, built their compositions, worked with paint, the materiality of paint is so important to her. I think all of those things evidently are very important to her as a painter. But specifically with Goya, I think it's interesting that Martha's been very open about the fact that the experience of the pandemic was very difficult for her. She was very isolated, felt very much on her own. And we see a few bodies of work that are really compelling that actually are in our exhibition at the Guggenheim Bilbao coming out of that period. And one of the reasons that Goya felt so relevant to Martha during that time was that Goya, of course, lived at a very interesting time in Spain where, we see him as a sort of bridge figure moving towards modernism and a modern way of thinking, but coming out of really a horrifically turbulent time in Spain where there's this big transition. We think about the Inquisition, we think about a lot of the imagery, the sleep of reason, all of these things that he tackled in his work. And she really saw a through line to our contemporary times in terms of, what Goya was doing with his work and what's reflected there and the times that we're living in now.
And she's referred directly to the disasters of war, hasn't she? Not specifically in this work or in these particular bodies of work, but she said that the disasters of war, that incredible print series, is something which speaks to us today.
Right. Yes. I think like so many people, just continues to see the relevance in that body of work. As you just alluded to, a lot of the work, including the work that was shown in London in 2022 at Tadeusz Ropat Gallery, a lot of which is also on view in our exhibition, are from other series, standalone paintings that are very key paintings that Goya is known for today. So I think in terms of trying to be very forthcoming about the content, that's not really Martha's game. There's more oblique references there. I think, of course, the witches, we see the hats that are so unique. They either remind one of the KKK or the Inquisition, one of the two, I think.
Exactly.
So they have sort of a chilling effect. We see some of those. But then there's a lot of work that I think she was interested in, again, on a material level or as a painter, looking at another painter, that also made him a very interesting artist to her.
And you could not get a more painterly image than the one that she was responded to in this particular work, which is this still life. It's got various titles. The Louvre gives it one title, various other people have given it others. But basically, it's a still life with sides of meat and a mutton head, a sheep's head. Mm-hmm. And it's this incredible bloody work, wonderful use of the oil paint that Goya was so brilliant at commanding. And you can see totally why Martha's responded to this work.
Yes, exactly. I think it's a really fascinating juxtaposition maybe to Goya's work because this work is very monumental. We actually have sort of a series of 3 where we're demonstrating her interest in reducing an image down to only the most sort of necessary elements. The one that really interests me that you've just described has some real dense passages where we see her working with these oils. Also, it's worth mentioning that this work is on paper, sort of a thick brown craft paper, which figures very importantly into the image because one of the things that she's become interested in these recent years, and it's really evident in the series that's looking to Goya and also the later work looking at Manet, which, was only a year after the Goya series. She's interested in really allowing a lot of space in the composition. So there's quite a lot of open space where you're seeing the paper that she's working on. Gesture is very important. Color is very important. Color has always carried a real emotional charge in her work. And in this picture, you know, it really departs from Goya's depiction of the same scene in that we're looking at really bold colors, a lot of pinks, very strong yellows. Yellows aren't colors that Martha tends to use very often. Also a green. So it's really interesting because I also think that there's sort of a lineage maybe that she's calling on within Austrian painting that uses these very bright colors, but thinking about a very sort of traditional or historical still life. So it's really a wonderful contemporary take on a very, old painting. I think it feels very fresh.
It feels really fresh. And you're right about that colour, because she's not taken any of the kind of visceral power of Goya's painting away, in that the paint is very raw, to use that term that you used earlier on. But also at the same time, as you say, there are these rather lovely, almost confectionery colours, which seems to be almost a sort of counterpoint to the kind of rawness. So it's really interesting from that perspective, because Goya is very much sticking to reds, whites and blacks in terms of the background, isn't he?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the colour is, I think, I know that Martha resists the idea of sort of having signature colors. And indeed, as you look back, in this exhibition, we've got 5 decades worth of work. And so you see all different kinds of palettes being used at different moments in her career and really for specific purposes. But I would say that she definitely stands out, especially over the last years, as really calling on a lot of really bold pinks, purples, reds, mixing these in really different, interesting ways. And for me, I do feel like that is one of her sort of, go-to colors. And we see that a lot in this painting. So it's interesting because it feels very Martha Jungwirth. You see this gesture, you see splashes, you see the emotion and the energy that an 82-year-old artist was putting into this gigantic painting. And yeah, I think it's such a wonderful departure, again, from this beautiful traditional painting that we would really call a masterpiece.
I wanted to build on the fact that Martha made a very powerful body of work in relation to the destruction of animals in Australia and the bushfires there. And it seems to me that this must link to that body of work to a certain degree, because she's talked about how we're living in a catastrophe, and that's one of the reasons that Goya is so sort of current to our age. That's why he speaks to us from the past. And it seems to me in this work, actually, it relates to that kind of idea of this massive destruction of animals, which she was so affected by in Australia.
I absolutely see the link, and I hope that this is clear when people come to visit the exhibition, but I've placed the sort of final work from the Australia series at the beginning of this room that is more centered on art history, because bushfires are nothing new to Australia. But as we're seeing all over the world with climate change, things are becoming more intense, more frequent. And, most of us remember in 2019 and 20, the worst bushfires where there were, billions of species that perished, plants, insects, animals. There was no way for these things to escape the fires. And Martha, again, this coincides with the pandemic, watching these poor animals perish in this fire. This led right into then thinking about Goya as a source of inspiration, as a figure who was living when the world felt very unstable, which I think is very much a parallel to what she was feeling. And, I think also what many people would acknowledge feels very true today, and especially maybe in 2020. So, yeah, I think that there's a really interesting link. I think also materially we see in that the series is called Australiadelphia, and it really refers to this group of mammals that scientists have identified as having changed very, very, very little over millions of years that are located in Australia. And it's a very abstract series. That series, I think, would be very difficult to, if you don't have the title as a way to sort of give you a lead, you wouldn't be able to identify that you're looking at animals or a contemplation of what happened during those bushfires. But we see, in terms of her painterly approach, the same ideas that she executes in both the Goya and Manet series, which are this real loosening of the gesture. You've got these compositions that are very thoughtful. They happen at very certain places on the paper. And again, we're not talking about canvas. She's selected huge swaths of this, again, brown paper, sometimes a more cardboard surface. These are surfaces that she doesn't treat, but that have a finish that allows the paint to move very smoothly, almost like in a gloss across the paper. So she's got a lot of control over the movement. So you can see her really working with the paint in a specific way. You also are able to see those splotches and, drips and all of those moments that she likes to embrace, thinking about those as chance, but then really leaving a lot of space around the composition. So I think formally speaking, there's a very evident connection in the way that she's beginning to work, which is a departure from the earlier work where she often, is thinking about the surface as edge to edge and filling a lot of the space. This is very different. She's, I think, restraining a little bit, maybe using her energy where it's really necessary and trying to just paint the image that she needs us to see with the fewest lines and splotches, which she often uses that word, the fewest possible. Right. So it's a really interesting connection, even though maybe on the surface it feels like two very different bodies of work.
Well, Lekha, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you, Ben.
Martha Jungwirth is at the Guggenheim in Bilbao until the 22nd of September. And that's it for this episode. You can find us on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Tan Audio, and on Facebook, Instagram, and Threads. The Week in Art is produced by Julia Michalska, Alexander Morrison, and David Clack, and David's also the editor and sound designer. Thanks also to Daniela Hathaway and to our guests, Sarah, Victoria, and Lekha. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next week. Bye for now.